Before there was Napoleon Bonaparte, before there was Sun Tzu's rediscovery in Western military academies, before European generals were celebrated in paintings and monuments for revolutionizing the art of war, there was a man standing on the hills of southern Africa who had already solved every problem they were still struggling with. He had already answered questions about speed, mobility, encirclement, and psychological dominance that would take European military science another century to even begin asking. His name was Shaka Zulu, and the reason you may not have learned his name in school, the reason his genius was not part of your military history curriculum, the reason his tactics were not discussed alongside Caesar and Alexander, that absence is not an accident. That absence is a choice. And understanding that choice, understanding why it was made and who made it, is one of the most powerful acts of reclamation available to the African diaspora today. Because when you know that your ancestors were not waiting to be civilized, when you know that they were engineering brilliance where Europe was still learning what brilliance looked like, you begin to understand who you actually are. That is what this story is about. To understand the full weight of what Shaka accomplished, you have to place yourself in southern Africa at the turn of the 19th century, in a region the Zulu people called KwaZulu, which translates roughly as the place of heaven. This was not empty land, not a wilderness waiting to be named and ordered. It was a living, breathing world of complex political relationships, cattle economies, trade networks, and deep spiritual traditions. The Nguni-speaking peoples who inhabited this region had been building societies there for centuries. They understood the land, the rivers, the seasons, and the patterns of conflict that occasionally erupted between chiefdoms competing for resources and prestige. Shaka was born around 1787, the illegitimate son of Sanzangakona, chief of the relatively small Zulu clan. His early life was marked by exile and hardship. His mother, Nondi, was forced to raise him in the households of other clans, where he learned to survive as an outsider, to read the social dynamics of groups that were not his own, and to observe how power actually worked beneath the surface of ceremony and tradition. These were not abstract lessons. These were survival skills, and they sharpened him. By the time Shaka came under the protection and mentorship of Dingiswayo, the paramount chief of the Mtetwa Confederation, he was already thinking differently about warfare. Dingiswayo himself had been reforming Nguni military practices, moving away from the ritualized, relatively low-casualty cattle raids that had historically governed interclan conflict towards something more organized and decisive. But Shaka took these seeds of reform and grew them into something that had no precedent in the region and, as history would later reveal, no parallel anywhere in the world at that time. When Shaka became chief of the Zulu clan in 1816 following his father's death, the Zulu numbered perhaps 1,500 people. Within a decade, through a combination of military conquest, political incorporation, and strategic alliance, he had forged a kingdom of more than 200,000. That transformation was not accomplished through brutality alone, though violence was certainly part of it. It was accomplished primarily through the wholesale reinvention of how an army thinks, moves, and fights. Shaka abolished the use of the long-throwing assegai, the traditional spear used at a distance, and replaced it with a shortened, broad-bladed stabbing spear called the ihuwa, a name that reportedly mimicked the sucking sound the blade made when pulled from a body. He paired this weapon with a large, body-length cowhide shield. The philosophy behind this change was radical. He was forcing his soldiers into close engagement, eliminating the option of fighting at a safe distance, demanding total commitment and total aggression. He trained his regiments, called amabuto, to run extraordinary distances at pace, sometimes 50 miles in a single day, without sandals, toughening their feet until they could traverse any terrain faster than any mounted or shod opponent. And then there was the formation that would later make military historians sit up and reconsider everything they thought they knew about the history of tactical genius. Shaka developed the Impondo Zankamo, which translates as the horns of the buffalo. The formation consisted of 3 distinct components operating in perfect coordination. The chest, the main body of the regiment, would engage the enemy frontally, pinning them in place, absorbing their attention and their aggression, holding them locked in direct combat. Then the 2 horns, younger, faster warriors, would sprint outward on both flanks simultaneously, curving around the sides of the enemy formation to encircle them completely, cutting off any retreat and collapsing the trap. Meanwhile, a reserve force called the Loins sat with their backs to the battle, deliberately not watching, preserving their focus and energy for the moment they were needed to reinforce any part of the formation that required it. The psychological design was as sophisticated as the physical mechanics. Commanders knew that soldiers watching a battle they had not yet entered would become anxious and potentially charge prematurely. By facing them away, Shaka managed the psychology of reserve troops with the same precision that he managed their positioning. This is the formation that Napoleon Bonaparte would famously employ at Austerlitz in 1805. It is the encirclement doctrine that Hannibal used at Cannae in 216 BC. Military scholars call it double envelopment, and they trace it through Western military history as a mark of transcendent genius wherever it appears. But Shaka was doing it before Napoleon was old enough to hold a sword. He was doing it in southern Africa, at scale, with armies that could move faster than any European force of the same period, and he was doing it with such consistency and such devastating effectiveness that he reshaped the political geography of an entire subcontinent. Now we must talk about what happened to this story, because the story of Shaka's military genius did not simply fail to travel. It was actively intercepted. The European encounter with Shaka and the Zulu Kingdom began in earnest with the arrival of British traders and adventurers at Port Natal, later renamed Durban, in the early 1820s. Figures like Henry Finn and Nathaniel Isaacs were among the first white men to make sustained contact with the Zulu court. Their accounts of Shaka, published in the 1830s and 1840s, established the template through which the Western world would understand him for over a century. Isaacs in particular, whose book Travels and Adventures in Eastern Africa was published in 1836, constructed a portrait of Shaka as a bloodthirsty tyrant, a savage despot who killed arbitrarily and on a massive scale. The military genius, the administrative innovation, the sophisticated political intelligence that had built a kingdom of hundreds of thousands, these things were either minimized, distorted, or simply left out. And this was